Here's something that should be impossible, and yet it's exactly what's been happening. Microsoft builds its own browser. Microsoft builds its own AI assistant. Microsoft installs that AI assistant directly into that browser as one single unified product from one single company. And when Linux users install that exact browser straight from Microsoft's own official download page, the AI assistant simply doesn't work. Not because Linux is incompatible, not because of some third-party plugin conflict, because Microsoft's own Linux build of its own browser is missing a single configuration file that the Windows version ships with by default. That's not a Linux problem. That's Microsoft shipping an incomplete product to its own users and leaving the Linux community to notice, diagnose, and fix it themselves. And it's exactly the kind of quiet, half-finished treatment that's left a lot of Linux users asking the same question over and over this year. Why does every single Microsoft product seem to treat Linux as the version that gets finished last, if it gets finished at all? Let's get into exactly what happened here, because the specifics matter. Microsoft Edge, yes, Microsoft's own web browser, the one built to replace Internet Explorer and positioned as the company's flagship gateway into its entire AI strategy, has had a genuine Linux version available for a few years now. That alone was actually a meaningful gesture when it first arrived. Edge launched its Linux beta back in 2020, and it took roughly a year and a half after that before it reached full stable channel status on Linux, trailing well behind the Windows and Mac releases the whole way. But it did arrive, and for a while that felt like a genuine olive branch. A company famous for treating Linux as an afterthought was, for once, putting real engineering effort into supporting it directly. It's worth putting that timeline next to how other major browser makers have handled the exact same platform, because the contrast is stark. Firefox has supported Linux natively since essentially day one of the modern Firefox project, with Linux treated as a core release platform rather than a secondary consideration. Google Chrome shipped stable Linux builds years before Edge even existed in its current Chromium-based form, and Chrome's Linux release has generally tracked closely with feature parity to its Windows counterpart. Even Opera, a far smaller company with a fraction of Microsoft's engineering resources, has maintained a genuinely equal Linux release for years. Against that backdrop, Edge arriving on Linux a full 5 years after Chrome, and then trailing behind on feature completeness even once it did arrive, isn't really explainable by Linux. Support is hard. Other companies with dramatically smaller budgets have managed it just fine. It's explainable by priority, and priority is a choice, not a technical constraint. Then, Microsoft built Copilot, its AI assistant, directly into Edge as one of the browser's headline features. A sidebar you can open at any time to summarize a page, ask questions, draft text, or get help with whatever you're looking at. On Windows, it works exactly the way you'd expect. Click the icon, the sidebar opens, Copilot responds. On Linux, running the exact same version of Edge, downloaded from the exact same official source, clicking that same Copilot icon does nothing. No sidebar, no response. No error message explaining why. Just silence, where a core, heavily marketed feature is supposed to be. The community reaction, once the cause was finally traced down, followed a very particular emotional arc that's worth walking through, because it explains exactly why furious is the right word rather than just annoyed. The first reaction, understandably, was confusion. People assuming they'd done something wrong on their own end, reinstalling the browser, checking permissions, digging through settings menus, looking for some toggle they might have missed. The second reaction was frustration at how little official information existed anywhere explaining the problem, forcing affected users to piece together the cause themselves across scattered forum posts and developer blogs. And the third reaction, once someone actually identified the missing hub apps file and published a fix, was something closer to genuine anger. Not primarily at the bug itself, but at how avoidable it clearly was. A single missing file is the kind of thing a 5-minute manual test would have caught before shipping. The fact that it wasn't caught, and that it took outside community effort to even explain what had gone wrong, read to a lot of affected users less like an honest mistake and more like proof that nobody at Microsoft had bothered to actually launch and use the Linux build before pushing it out the door. That reaction gets sharper still when you consider how it lands specifically on people who had recently made an active choice to trust Microsoft's stated commitment to Linux. Plenty of Linux users installed Edge, specifically because it was one of the rare Microsoft products that seemed to be making a genuine, sustained effort at cross-platform parity. A reason, however small, to feel slightly more optimistic about Microsoft's broader relationship with the platform. Discovering that even this specific product, the one held up as evidence of good faith, still shipped with a broken headline feature, doesn't just create frustration about one bug. It undercuts the entire basis for extending Microsoft any benefit of the doubt going forward. Once trust like that gets broken on the one product that was supposed to be the counterexample, it's a lot harder to take the next piece of "we're committed to Linux" messaging at face value. As it turns out, the Copilot sidebar in Edge depends on a specific configuration file called hubapps, which tells the browser which mini applications, Copilot among them, are allowed to load inside that sidebar panel. On Windows, that file ships as part of the standard installation. On the Linux build of the exact same browser, it's simply absent, not corrupted, not disabled behind a settings toggle, missing entirely, as if nobody on the Linux packaging side of Edge's development ever checked whether the feature everyone was going to expect to work actually did. The fix, once someone finally tracked down the cause, turned out to be almost embarrassingly simple. Manually download that missing hubapps configuration file yourself, place it in the correct folder, and restart the browser. A single command, using a basic download tool most Linux systems already have installed, and the sidebar springs to life exactly as it should have from the start. That simplicity is almost the most frustrating part of this entire story. This isn't some deep architectural incompatibility between Copilot and the Linux kernel that would take Microsoft's engineers months to resolve. It's one missing file, sitting in one wrong folder, that nobody at Microsoft apparently bothered to check before shipping the Linux build out the door. Think about what that actually implies about how this release was put together internally. Somewhere inside Microsoft, an engineering team built the Windows version of Edge with Copilot fully wired up and thoroughly tested. Somewhere else, a separate build process will package that same browser for Linux. And at some point in that packaging process, one file simply didn't make the trip over. That's the kind of gap that a basic quality assurance pass, actually launching the Linux build and clicking the Copilot icon before shipping it, would have caught in about 10 seconds. The fact that it wasn't caught says less about the difficulty of the bug and more about how much testing attention the Linux release channel actually gets before Microsoft considers it ready for the public. And this is exactly the pattern that's been building Linux users' frustration all year. Not because any single incident is catastrophic on its own, but because it keeps happening across completely different products, in completely different ways, all pointing at the exact same underlying attitude. We've covered on this channel how Microsoft discontinued the dedicated native Teams client for Linux back in 2022, replacing it with a browser-based app that then turned out to behave inconsistently, specifically on Firefox. Running on Linux, requiring users to weaken their own privacy settings just to join a basic work call. We've covered how a routine Secure Boot security update in 2024 broke dual boot systems running Linux alongside Windows, took 9 months to properly fix, and how a follow-up certificate transition in 2026 quietly left dual boot users exposed again with almost no public warning. We've covered how a free built-in word processor that shipped with Windows for 28 years got quietly retired with Microsoft's own documentation pointing users toward a paid subscription instead of any comparable free alternative. Now add this to the pile: Microsoft's own browser, running Microsoft's own AI assistant, shipping to Linux users in a state that doesn't actually work because of an oversight basic testing should have caught immediately. None of these stories, taken individually, prove some grand conspiracy. But taken together, across years, across completely unrelated engineering teams and product lines within the same company, they add up to a consistent, unmistakable signal. Whatever process Microsoft uses internally to decide what counts as done and ready to ship applies a noticeably lower bar to the Linux version of nearly everything it builds, compared to the bar Windows releases have to clear. That's the real substance behind the frustration driving this video's title. It's not that Linux users expect every single piece of software ever built to work flawlessly on their platform of choice. That would be an unreasonable standard for any operating system to hold every developer to. It's that Microsoft specifically keeps positioning itself as having made a genuine commitment to Linux support, building the Edge. Linux Client in the first place was exactly that kind of gesture, and then keeps failing to follow through on the basic maintenance and testing that commitment implies. It's worth being fair here, because the full picture matters, and it would be dishonest to pretend Microsoft has done nothing at all for Linux users. The company genuinely does maintain a real Edge browser built for Linux, continues shipping regular updates to it, and has invested actual engineering time into keeping Windows Subsystem for Linux, the compatibility layer that lets Linux run directly inside Windows, updated and reasonably well supported. Azure, Microsoft's cloud computing platform, runs a massive amount of Linux infrastructure under the hood, and Microsoft has even built its own Linux distributions specifically for cloud and container workloads. None of this is a company that hates Linux or refuses to engage with it at all. If anything, that makes stories like the missing hubapps file more frustrating, not less, because it proves Microsoft clearly has the internal expertise and infrastructure to support Linux properly when it actually prioritizes doing so. The failures aren't happening because Microsoft doesn't know how. They're happening because product by product, feature by feature, Linux support keeps landing at the bottom of somebody's priority list, even in situations where the company has every technical capability to do better. That distinction matters because it changes what the fair criticism actually is. The complaint isn't Microsoft refuses to support Linux. The complaint is Microsoft repeatedly announces or implies genuine support for Linux, then treats the actual maintenance and testing of that support as optional in a way it would never tolerate for the Windows version of the same product. Imagine, for a moment, if Copilot simply didn't load at all for a meaningful percentage of Windows users because of one missing configuration file that shipped by mistake. That would be treated internally as a shipping blocking bug, caught in testing, fixed before release, or patched within hours if it somehow slipped through anyway. The fact that the equivalent failure on Linux apparently sat unnoticed long, enough for the community to have to diagnose and document the fix themselves, tells you everything about the relative priority these two platforms actually receive, regardless of what any public messaging around Linux support might suggest. There's also a particular sting to this story that the previous incidents on this channel didn't quite have. And it's worth naming directly because it's part of why furious is genuinely the right word for how a lot of affected users have reacted. The team story was about a product Microsoft never fully committed to on Linux in the first place. The native client got pulled, and everything since has felt like managing an afterthought. The Secure Boot story was about a shared industry standard where blame is genuinely distributed across multiple parties, not just Microsoft. But Edge on Linux was different. Microsoft chose to build it. Microsoft chose to market it as evidence of a broader commitment to cross-platform support. Microsoft chose to bundle Copilot into it as a headline feature. Every one of those was a deliberate decision made by Microsoft about a product Microsoft controls completely from top to bottom. There's no shared standard to blame here, no third-party dependency, no legacy codebase from 30 years ago causing unavoidable friction. It's Microsoft's own software, built entirely by Microsoft, shipping in a broken state on a platform Microsoft explicitly chose to support. That's a much harder failure to wave away as an unavoidable technical complication. It's also worth talking about what this specific incident reveals about how Microsoft's AI push is actually being executed across the company right now, because Copilot isn't just one feature among many. It's arguably the single most heavily promoted, most aggressively integrated product Microsoft has shipped in years. Copilot branding shows up across Windows, across Office, across Edge, across GitHub, across nearly every corner of the company's product lineup, all pointing toward the same broader strategic bet that AI assistants are the future of how people interact with software. When a company is investing that much marketing energy and strategic weight into a single feature, you'd expect the actual engineering execution behind it to match that level of priority everywhere it ships. Instead, the Linux build of the exact product carrying that entire strategic narrative couldn't even get a single configuration file copied over correctly. That gap between the size of the marketing push and the quality of the actual execution on Linux is, in a lot of ways, the whole story in miniature. Let's talk about the workaround itself for a moment, because once again, it follows the exact same shape we've documented across every one of these stories. The fix wasn't discovered by Microsoft's own support channels, and it wasn't proactively communicated to affected users through any official announcement. It was traced down by an independent developer, written up as a short community guide, and shared for free, so that anyone else hitting the same wall could copy a single missing file and fix the problem themselves in under a minute. That's become close to a running theme at this point. Microsoft ships something broken or incomplete for Linux users, official support stays quiet or slow, and the actual fix ends up coming from exactly the community whose frustration the whole situation was caused by in the first place. It's a strange, slightly backwards arrangement. The affected users doing Microsoft's quality assurance work for it for free, out of necessity. It's worth imagining for a moment how the same situation would have played out if the roles were reversed. If a widely used third-party application shipped on Windows with a headline feature completely non-functional due to one missing file, and Microsoft's own support forums stayed silent on it for an extended stretch, while independent developers had to trace the cause themselves. That scenario would likely generate genuine scrutiny of that third-party developer's competence and reliability. The fact that an equivalent failure happening inside Microsoft's own first-party product doesn't generate the same scrutiny, because it's quietly absorbed as just how the Linux build works sometimes, is itself part of the double standard driving this frustration. Linux users aren't asking for special treatment. They're asking for the same baseline of quality control that Windows users take for granted. without ever having to think about it. So where does this leave things, especially for anyone reading all of this and wondering whether it's worth the hassle to keep using Microsoft's own tools on Linux at all? The honest answer is nuanced, and it's worth resisting the temptation to oversimplify it just for the sake of a clean narrative. Edge on Linux, once you've applied the one-line community fix, works genuinely well. Full Copilot functionality, reasonable performance, real ongoing updates. This isn't a story about a product that's permanently broken. It's a story about a product that shipped broken, stayed broken, long enough for the community to have to solve it independently, and reveals a testing and quality process that treats Linux as a lower tier priority, even for Microsoft's own flagship first-party software. Those are two different claims, and it's worth being precise about which one the evidence actually supports. It's also worth thinking through the practical calculus for someone deciding what to actually do with this information, rather than just how to feel about it. If you're already running Linux and you specifically need Copilot's functionality for work or personal, applying the community fix takes a few minutes and genuinely resolves the problem. There's no need to abandon Edge entirely over a single missing file once you know how to add it back. But if you're Linux curious and evaluating which browser to make your daily driver, this story is a legitimate, relevant data point in that decision, not an incidental footnote. A browser that ships its flagship feature broken on your platform and stays that way long enough for outside developers to have to document the fix themselves is telling you something honest about how much ongoing attention you should expect that product to receive on Linux going forward. Firefox and Chrome, whatever their other trade-offs, haven't put Linux users in that position with a comparably prominent feature. That's a legitimate factor to weigh, not just channel-driven pattern spotting for its own sake, and that precision matters, because overstating the case, treating every one of these incidents as proof of some deliberate campaign against Linux, would actually undersell the more accurate and, honestly, more damning explanation. This isn't sabotage, it's neglect. Repeated often enough across enough different products that neglect starts to look and feel exactly like a policy, even without anyone at Microsoft ever having to write one down. Every additional data point, Teams, Secure Boot certificates, WordPad, and now Copilot's missing configuration file in Edge, makes it a little harder to write off the previous one as an isolated coincidence. At some point, a long enough pattern of individually small oversights stops needing malicious intent to produce a genuinely consistent and genuinely frustrating outcome for the people affected by it. It's worth thinking about where this pattern goes from here, because nothing about the underlying incentives driving it looks likely to change on its own. Microsoft's core business and the overwhelming majority of its engineering resources remain oriented around Windows and its own first-party ecosystem. That's not going to shift just because Linux's desktop share has grown this year, which means the realistic expectation going forward isn't that Microsoft suddenly starts treating every Linux release with the same rigor as its Windows counterpart. It's that this same shape of story, a product that technically exists on Linux, technically gets updates, but quietly ships with gaps that wouldn't survive a day on Windows before getting caught and fixed. It keeps happening across whatever the next product happens to be. Copilot's expansion across more of Microsoft's product line, if anything, makes this more likely, not less, simply because there are more surfaces for exactly this kind of oversight to slip through unnoticed. There's a reasonable case that increased public attention. Videos exactly like this one, community bug reports that get amplified rather than buried in a support forum nobody reads, could eventually shift that calculus, at least at the margins. Companies do respond to sustained, visible pressure when it starts to affect their public reputation in a way that's hard to ignore. But that kind of pressure only builds if these individual incidents keep getting connected to each other and treated as a pattern rather than each one being written off in isolation as an unfortunate but forgivable one-time mistake. That's exactly why stacking these stories together, Teams, Secure Boot, WordPad, and now this, matters more than any single incident does on its own. It's worth connecting this back to the bigger structural shift we've tracked on this channel all year, because the stakes here are rising, not staying flat. We've covered how entire government agencies in Germany, Denmark, and Switzerland, among others, have been actively migrating away from Microsoft's ecosystem toward Linux, citing cost savings, security autonomy, and increasingly, a desire for technological independence from any single foreign vendor. Those aren't hobbyist decisions made by enthusiasts in a forum. Those are institutional budget-driven choices made by governments running real cost-benefit analysis, and every one of those institutions, even after migrating away from Windows, still frequently needs to interact with Microsoft's broader software ecosystem in some capacity, whether that's Edge for compatibility with specific web tools, or Office file formats, or cloud services running on Azure. When the specific Microsoft products those institutions still rely on keep shipping in a visibly lower quality state on Linux than on Windows, it doesn't just create day-to-day friction for individual employees. It quietly reinforces exactly the argument those governments made in the first place, that depending on a single vendor's roadmap and priorities, even partially, carries real risk when that vendor doesn't treat your platform as an equal priority. There's a similar dynamic playing out in the corporate world on a smaller scale, but with the same underlying shape. IT departments increasingly allow developers and technical staff to run Linux on company-issued laptops, precisely because so much of the modern software development stack, containers, cloud infrastructure, command line tooling, is built with Linux as the default assumption anyway. Those same organizations, in the vast majority of cases, still rely on Microsoft's ecosystem for everything from identity management to productivity software to internal communication. Every time a Microsoft product ships in a visibly rougher state on the Linux side of that split, it adds one more small data point to an internal conversation IT departments are increasingly having. Is standardizing on Microsoft's tools actually the safest, most efficient choice anymore? Or is it becoming a source of recurring friction that a fully cross-platform alternative, open source or otherwise, might avoid entirely? If you're running Edge on Linux right now and you've never gotten the Copilot sidebar to load, go check whether this is your exact problem. It's a genuinely quick fix once you know where to look, and there's no reason to keep living with a broken feature you were told would just work out of the box. And if this pattern of Microsoft quietly under-supporting Linux across its own ecosystem is starting to sound familiar, that's because we've been tracking it all year on this channel. Go check out the videos on the Teams lockout and the Secure Boot certificate mess linked right here, because together they paint a much clearer picture than any single incident does on its own. Subscribe if you want to keep seeing exactly where the next gap in that pattern shows up, because if this year has taught us anything, it's that there's always another one. And if you've run into a Microsoft product on Linux that shipped with its own quiet gap like this one, something that technically works on Windows but falls apart or simply never arrives the moment you switch platforms, tell us about it in the comments below. At this point, cataloging these incidents one by one is exactly how a pattern this scattered and this quiet actually becomes visible enough for anyone, including Microsoft itself, to have to take it seriously.